Welcome to the Diverse Bookshelf. I'm Samia Aziz, celebrating the power of literature and the voices of authors and changemakers from the global majority. Join me as we explore the stories that inspire, connect, and transform our world. Let's uncover the stories that truly matter together. Today, my guest is the absolutely wonderful Fatin Abbas. Fatin was born in Khartoum, Sudan, but her parents were forced to leave Sudan when the military seized power there in 1989, when she was just 8 years old. The family settled in New York. She earned a BA in English Literature from the University of Cambridge, a PhD in Comparative Literature from Harvard University, and an MFA in Creative Writing from Hunter College, the City University of New York. Her novel, Ghost Season, is an exploration of Sudan's almost unrecognised history through 5 vibrant and interesting characters who find themselves working for an NGO in a border town between North and South Sudan. It's a really powerful story of power dynamics, colonialism, history, love, friendship, identity, belonging, self-acceptance, and so much more. After more than 16 months of war, Sudan has descended into one of the worst humanitarian crises. The country is at an imminent risk of collapse after over a year of violent conflict and is on the verge of mass famine, with its food supply decimated and young children now starving to death in its cities, villages, and displacement camps. Over 10 million people have been displaced, and every single person in Sudan is affected by this worsening crisis. I hope this conversation today introduces you to a really brilliant novel that I really hope you read. But I hope it also helps us to keep Sudan in our thoughts, hearts, minds, prayers, and in our activism always. I'm so glad to be speaking to Fatin today. Hello, Fatin. Welcome to the Diverse Bookshelf podcast. It's so wonderful to have you on the show today. I cannot wait to speak to you. How are you doing?
Thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here. I'm okay. Obviously, with all of the news in the world, it's difficult to be in a good mood, but all things considered, I'm fine. Yeah.
Yeah, it does. It's such a strange, I think there's constant feeling of association of not really being able to exist fully in any real moment, and to constantly feel, I think, grief and pain and fear as well. And obviously, I know that you are Sudanese, you lived in Sudan as a child. I know that your family are still there, and some of your family have managed to leave recently. But yeah, I can't imagine the toll that's taking on you personally, but also then to see what's happening in Sudan to the place that people, a country and a community that you know and love as well. It must be incredibly difficult. So
Yeah, no, it is difficult, but it's also nice to just have this sense of community and to be able to talk about the book and to talk about Sudan, also because it is so invisible in the news. So it's also a chance just for people to hear more about it, either through the book or just talking about what's happening to my family and to so many families that are affected by this war that's happening right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And so your book, Ghost Season, is one I read fairly recently, and I just think it's so really beautiful, very raw, and so interesting as well. Before we get into the intricacies of the novel, I would love to know what your journey as a writer has been like. What led you into writing? How long have you been writing for? And what do you hope to do as a writer? Because you are so talented.
Thank you. It's a long journey. If I have to think about my origin story as a writer, I have to go back to my childhood and really this moment of displacement that my family went through when we left Sudan in 1990. This was the beginning of the Omar al-Bashir dictatorship, who came to power in 1989. And then my father was arrested. He spent a year in prison. And after that, my parents decided that we had to leave Sudan. And so we left, and we were very lucky that we ended up in the US, in New York. And that's essentially where I spent most of my childhood. I was 8 at the time. And I remember very clearly that I started writing stories, these very long stories, when we first arrived in the US. And I would get an assignment at school, go write a story, and I would go and fill 3 notebooks worth of a story. And if I have to make sense of it now, I think there was something about writing, about storytelling at that moment when my family was going through all of these changes, when I was going through all of these changes as a child, as transitions, these difficult transitions, adjusting to a new country, a new place, where somehow storytelling became like this safe space where I had some sense of control, a sense of agency as a child, and where I was very happy. And so that's where it started. And then as I got older, I left the storytelling, the fiction writing, but I always stayed close to literature. So I studied literature as an undergraduate. I did a PhD in comparative literature, focusing on African literature. And so for me, if not writing stories, reading stories was always very important. And then during grad school, when I was doing my PhD, I just used the time when I was there. I was writing about various African writers, but I also used that time to really start experimenting and writing a lot and taking creative writing workshops. And through that, I took the leap and committed really to writing, to being a writer. And it took a while, because I think also, as being child of immigrants, there's always this sense of being an artist or a writer is not the most, let's say, lucrative career choice. But it felt like something absolutely necessary that I couldn't. This is also the interesting thing when you talk to a lot of writers, that it's not really, it didn't feel so much like a choice. It was something that it almost felt like there was no choice. I had to write. And so I committed wholeheartedly and have been doing that, for a while now.
So this book, Ghost Season, it is very clearly about Sudan. It's about displacement. It's about some of Sudan's history. It's also about friendship and, I guess, unexpected friendship and love. But generally, how would you say, like, all of the upheaval that you've experienced, the growing up knowing that your father was imprisoned for a year, and the big decisions that your family made to leave Sudan at that time? And I understand that after a decade in exile that your father returned. These are huge things for a person to grapple with, let alone a child. How do you think that form, or that time of processing and understanding all of this stuff, has impacted you as a writer?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it was all very important, because for me, I left Sudan very young, but I always obviously maintained a strong relationship because I had so much extended family there. After a few years, my father couldn't go back for about 10 years. We went back after 5 years, and extended family was always there. And for me, Sudan was my place of origin, and it's the place that I left as a child. And therefore, I always felt this need to make sense of it and to make sense of my relationship to it, right? So it was, in some sense, I also think of Ghost Season as a story that I'm telling myself about Sudan, right? A story that in which I'm trying to make sense of my own kind of place of origin, my own story of origin. And I think I was also trying to understand there was what was happening with my family on the micro level, in terms of all of this displacement and this upheaval that my family went through. But that was also, on a small scale, a mirror of all of these upheavals that the country was going through, beginning with the Bashir dictatorship in 1989, and these civil wars, right? These successive civil wars. The North South Civil War, of course, is the original war. And for me, the event that was quite important was in 2011, when South Sudan seceded. Sudan became 2 countries. And there was something about seeing this map that was so fixed in my head change overnight, seeing this map of Sudan suddenly split in two, and trying to understand why did all of this happen? What All of this upheaval, why did South Sudan secede, and what is the relationship really of the South Sudanese to the north and vice versa? And I was thinking about that. And also, I think of the book also about Sudan as this country that's on the border of the Middle East and Africa. And it's this place that is bringing together historically, where you have so many cultures, languages, religions, a kind of meeting. And how, in a sense, for me, was it's a book that's thinking about how does one kind of form a whole out of this diversity, right? Thinking also about the characters in the book as forming a kind of non-biological family is one way I think about it, or this friendship that you talk about, these friendships, relationships, these romantic relationships that form across these ethnic divides, religious divides, linguistic divides. So I was really trying to think about that as well, because I felt that these borders of Sudan were not, they had managed, they didn't bring people together, that within the borders there was a lot of conflict and violence. And it was for me trying to understand why was that happening, and then where do we find hope, where do we find the
Mm.
spaces where these relationships and these connections can exist beyond the kind of political macro politics or macro kind of conflicts that are happening.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think in the pages of history textbooks, we often we often read about partition or independence, and because they're often written from a colonial lens or a white lens, like whatever it may be, we don't really understand the devastation that has come with that. You have
Mm,
a fracturing of what was once one nation, and what that has done to all of those the people, the millions and the millions of people, and the families that are sometimes physically torn between borders, and the lives lost because partition, in whatever way it is and whatever word that is used to describe it, is never peaceful. It's always bloody, it's always violent, but
mm,
a history textbook will have you think otherwise. And I can really understand that sort of yearning for you to understand what, because it's also relatively recent, and to understand what happened and like why and the implications as well, because
mm,
there's always also in the other thing about partition is that it never results in equality. There's
mm,
always someone always ends up having the upper hand in some way, shape, or form.
mm,
And it's fascinating, but it's brutal and
mm,
heartbreaking and devastating. And so I'm really glad that you describe it as a sort of way for you to connect to your roots and you to understand and to explore. And it does in many ways. If it's a very explorative novel.
mm.
Would you take a moment just to introduce Ghost Season?
Yes, absolutely. So, Ghost Season is a novel that is set in a fictional border town between North and South Sudan. And a lot of the action of the novel takes place in this NGO compound that is in this town, where these five characters are living together, working together. And there's William, who is a South Sudanese translator, or also like a fixer who works with this American NGO worker who's sent to this town to update maps of Saraya. The town is called Saraya. Then there is Dina, who is a nomad, comes from a nomadic family, Arabic speaking Muslim family, who works as a cook in the compound. There's this 12-year-old boy, Mustafa, who is like an errand boy. He also works there and lives there. And then there's Dina, who is this Sudanese American character who grew up in the US and then comes back to this town. She's a young artist. She makes documentary films, and she's making an art film where she's trying to film and capture something about this town. And as these characters are living their lives in the novel, there's the North South Civil War is somehow in the background. So there's the North South Civil War unfolding. The novel is set in the early 2000s. And there is this fear of the violence coming closer to the town. And the book begins with the appearance of this unidentified dead body that's brought to the compound, that's found by a riverside. And the body's brought to the compound, and nobody can identify this corpse. Nobody knows which ethnic group it belongs to, which cemetery, which burial rites should be given to this corpse. And from there, the events of the novel begin to unfold. So maybe that's, yeah, I'll stop there.
And so this novel is centered around these 5 characters who are in many ways like, I don't know, like unlikely friends. And like when I take a step back, I just think, okay, it makes sense that like a UN compound is where these 5 characters are most likely to have met. I don't know where else you could have a Sudanese American filmmaker and a translator and then Alex. I don't understand how else they could have met. But I was really fascinated with the fact that it was based in this UN compound. So I also work in the development sector, and so I found some bits really, I was like chuckling away to myself, just understanding what development work is and how it's frustrating, and getting permission from authorities, and the way that you have to deal with people high up, and you know, this issue when it comes to foreigners and how foreigners are treated and all of that. And I know that the development sector gets a lot of stick as well, and it's not wouldn't be fair of me to say that it's completely plain sailing and that it's completely good. There are many issues with the sector, and there is corruption everywhere for sure as well. But what were you particularly interested when it comes to the development sector and like the UN?
Basically, I spent a year after university actually working with an NGO, an Irish NGO in Sudan. And that was a really interesting experience because it really exposed me. It was the first time that I worked in that kind of environment. And what I was really struck by, on the one hand, I think the development aid industries is important and does a lot of really important work. On the other hand, I think there is something that struck me about these kind of colonial continuities in the way that these international NGOs, whether it's the UN or a small NGO like the one I was working for, that come in, and the sort of these relationships and hierarchies that very much reflect a colonial relationship between the global north and south, right? In the way that, you know, who is given the decision making power in an NGO, who is in control of the resources and the money and decides where the money goes. How are people from the country itself treated in relation to the foreign aid workers who come in? So I was interested by taking this NGO setting or this motif of the NGO and exploring it in the novel. I was really thinking about this kind of white savior industrial complex is another way to say it. It's used
Yeah.
Bull's kind of term. And the character of Alex, this American aid worker, is the character that I explore those questions through, because he's sent to this town to update these maps, right? These old maps of the district. And he thinks he comes in and he's very sure, okay, this is easy. I'm just going to do this. I have this task. I'm going to map this town, this district. And actually it turns out to be a much more difficult job and a mission than that he realizes. He ends up going almost on this absurd quest to try to make a map that is impossible to make. So I was trying to, think about these limitations and the way that the whole aid industry is structured, which I think is very problematic. And this is not to say this doesn't apply to all NGOs everywhere, but certainly in a lot of, I think, the industry, it is problematic. I was interested in that, but also, like you said, NGOs are interesting because they are these spaces that bring together people from such different backgrounds, parts of the world, cultures, all working together in the same environment. And this is also really interesting, I think, in terms of the relationships that then emerge in that kind of a work context.
Yeah, I just I find it so interesting because I think I've read a lot of books that feature an NGO in some way, or like a project, or somebody that goes on this like volunteering expedition, and it's wonderful but difficult, and there's all these things that come up. But I really liked the fact that so many of these big questions were explored through the character of Alex, who is highly unlikable in many ways. Like he didn't really see such a great side to him. But it was so interesting because I think because he was the only white character, so much of it was so glaringly obvious, which when you are in that setting is not always the case, because often there are a number of people and there's a lot of systems and a lot of processes, and you just end up getting on with things. But I think because he was the only one, and they were a very small team anyway, and like Layla is the cook, so she wasn't really getting involved, and Mustafa was like the errand boy, so there was only really the three of them. But it just made it so clear, some of the things that you were really trying to get us to think about, which is this, as you said, this relationship between essentially the Western, or the colonizer, and the rest of the world, if you like, which I found so interesting, because it's I guess one of the problems that I often feel is that if you go to an NGO almost anywhere in the world, they all operate very similar, even though the context within which they are entirely different, which doesn't make sense really in and of itself, because then what we've done, essentially what the sector has done, is taken this model that is British or it's American, and it's plonked it in the middle of Sudan or Pakistan or Darfur, like wherever it is, and they're just trying to make everything work around that, which is not, we know that it's not empowering, it's not best for the community, it doesn't give people the authority or the position or the power to make decisions that they need to make for their own well-being and for whatever it is that they actually need. Yeah, there's just so much going on, and I really...
Yeah, absolutely. And I would also add exactly that each place is different, right? And this is part of the challenge that Alex faces when he comes to make this map of the district of Saraya. It's thinking about Western cartography, the roots of cartography in Western knowledge systems. And the fact that when I was actually researching the history of cartography in this region of Sudan that inspires the novel, which is the border region between North and South Sudan, which is also where I worked with an NGO, this NGO that I was working with in Khartoum. But that when the British arrived and they were trying to map this region of Sudan, they had a lot of trouble because of this wet, dry geography, this kind of seasonal geography that changes. So they would map a river and then it would just disappear. And then they would be really confused because, it's gone. And so I found that really fascinating. So he comes in very sure about his systems and his way of containing and mapping and understanding the place, but finds that the place exceeds the limits of the map that he's trying to make. And I think that's something, to think about, that you have this model of an NGO, of certain systems that are applied no matter the location, no matter the context, no matter the problems that are being faced. So absolutely I agree with these issues that you brought up.
And I think it's so clever that the role that you had given Alex was to draw a map, because that's not insignificant if we think about history. It's this idea that we have somebody, a Westerner, an American, or a British person coming and essentially either trying to portray an image of a country in a certain way, physically in the form of a map, or deciding the lines of partition, which is what we saw in the partition of India. They're saying, the same thing happened. We had a white British man fly to India and try to draw a map of partition, which was a disaster anyway. But it's just, I just thought it was so interesting and fascinating that that's what he was doing, and couldn't do it anyway, because it's an impossible task. But and we also have one of my favorite characters, I think, is Dina, who is a Sudanese American filmmaker, and she's on a mission to make what she calls, I think, like an observation film. An observational film, maybe. which is not a documentary, and so she's trying to take different shots and just film what's going on in order to portray things as they are. And I found it so interesting that this was her style, if you like, her mood. She was trying to show in many ways that she didn't want to dictate the story that was being told. Why did you decide for her to be a filmmaker rather than, say, a writer or even a photographer?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. And again, I have to go back to my own autobiography. I think Dina, in terms of autobiography, is the closest to me in terms of background, the kind of growing up in the US, coming back to Sudan. But I also spent the summer during grad school making a documentary film in the city of Omdurman, which is also part of Greater Khartoum. And I just spent the summer going to a neighborhood and filming these men who make these big clay pots, and they're water pots, right? And most of the men who work in this neighborhood are displaced from Darfur, South Sudan. And it was a really interesting experience for me because of this relationship of looking, this thing of me coming with a camera and filming people, and the power dynamics that then emerged in that relationship. I'm Sudanese, yes, but I'm also coming with a lot of privileges from the US with my American passport and my camera and all of this. And it really got me thinking about this question of the ethics of representation. What does it mean for somebody to represent a place, and what kind of ethics are involved in that? And it's obviously also a question that's relevant to Alex in a different way. And I think with Dina, so the reason I chose the filmmaking was partly because I was really interested in this, thinking about like the relationship of looking, and also her position as a diasporic artist who is looking back at her place of origin, her country of origin. And in a way, one of the things that I do find a little bit underexamined, right, if we're thinking about post-colonial literature or writing that's coming out of about the global south, is what is the relationship between the colonial gaze, the colonial look, the way that a colonizer looks, versus a diasporic subject, a person coming from the diaspora, right? Who is not a colonizer in the same way, but they're certainly coming with a lot of the privileges of access, right, to the global
Mm.
north, positionality in the global north. And so Dina, it's interesting because she looks down on Alex. She doesn't like him. She distances herself. She thinks she's doing something very different, and she is in a way. But I think she's a little bit naive about the fact that she thinks that she can just be in the town and like this fly on the wall, like filming without changing the scene that she's filming. Whereas in fact, what happens is that her very presence changes the scene, right? And that there is a certain, she doesn't think enough about the question of who is looking and who has the power to look, right? Who is looking and who is being looked at, and what does that suggest? And so I think I was really interested in exploring through her this position of the diasporic artist, the diasporic subject, and how they're gazing back, looking back at their culture, their place of origin, their culture of origin. And it's also a question that I theme and that I wanted to explore in the book, because it was something very much I was thinking about as I was writing the book myself, as a writer writing about Sudan, and thinking about how am I looking at Sudan, what is it that I'm seeing, what kind of representation is this? And it's also part of the reason I decided to fictionalize the town itself, because Saraya
Mm.
is, I spent time in a real town called Abyei in between North and South Sudan. But I decided to fictionalize Saraya partly because I wanted to be clear that in a way this is my own projection of Sudan. It's my own, from my position in the diaspora. It's a story about Sudan that I'm telling myself, but it's not the definitive story. It's not the authentic story. What is authenticity? And so for me, it's been really interesting because you have, for instance, when a Sudanese writer reads the book, they know that the town of Saraya does not exist in this
Mm.
piece. When somebody outside of Sudan doesn't read the book, I've had people come to me and say, "Oh, I Googled Saraya, this town, I couldn't find it," and I say, "Yeah, it doesn't exist." And this is partly like playing with this thing of like authenticity. What does it mean for me as a diasporic writer to be writing about, yeah, Sudan? So yeah, so Dina brings up all of these questions.
Yeah, I think I really felt for her in so many ways, because I really understand that on the one hand we do have this sort of being like, I'm a child of immigrants, being like neither fully from here and neither fully from there. But this is actually so much deeper than that. Is this idea that even when we do try and go back or go back to the motherland, we are unable to actually step out of our own privilege and our own prejudice, and we don't even realize that we have it until were faced with it.
Mhm.
And I know because I worked for an NGO in Pakistan
Mhm.
for, I want to say, about a year and a half.
Mhm.
And I was constantly confronted with this thing because I felt like I look the same as you all because I'm 100% Pakistani. I can speak the language okay-ish. I have a very British accent when I speak Urdu, but it's there. I'm dressed the same as you, like I eat the same food as you, but I fully understood almost immediately that
Mhm.
my presence in any situation changed the situation.
Mhm.
And there was nothing I could do about it. Even
Mhm.
I tried so hard to connect with people and just to try and just show my humanity and my shared heritage and my shared understanding, but it was always there. And I
Mhm.
also know that actually the way that I look at, I know I carry prejudice and stereotypes in my mind, even when I look at it, and I love that country, but I know that it's there.
Mhm.
And my husband, he was born and raised in Pakistan, so we've had many conversations over the years about this, and he will often pull me up on it, and he will say, "Look, you need to slow down with this thing that you're thinking. It's because you have this idea of like how somebody should be, or like how a family should be. Like you have this idea because of the privilege that you've had, and that doesn't mean that like I'm like particularly wealthy, but obviously like I have so much privilege just being born in the UK. And it's just so fascinating, I think, to be able to explore that through the character of Dina and to really, I think, be with her as she struggles with that because she is constantly struggling with it. And it's interesting to see the way that she really has this disdain for Alex. She
Yeah.
really dislikes him. She does not give him a chance, and every conversation they have turns into an argument. You're right in that she is definitely judging him because she sees herself, whether or not she realizes it, but she sees herself as superior to him.
Yeah.
She sees what he's doing as like almost like colonial, and she's
Mhm.
trying to give a voice to the people of Sudan in some ways, but she doesn't realize that she's also part of the problem. Um,
Mhm.
but it's a difficult problem to solve as people from the diaspora. But I guess it's not about solving it; it's about acknowledging it and understanding it as well.
Exactly. I think there's something about, yeah, about reflecting on it and reflecting
Mm.
on that position that we have it, because I think it doesn't mean necessarily I think there are also advantages and very positive things that come out of occupying this in between position,
Yeah.
between having a foot in both worlds. And I think that's also true of Dina. But I think it's important to reflect on that position and what it means to have certain privileges, and in other regards, not to have certain privileges. So she's also a woman, and there's this thing of having to navigate that whole, yeah, the gender questions. And that's also something, again, as somebody who grew up in the US, when I go back to Sudan, I really have to navigate, right, in
Mhm.
terms of what am I, especially since the previous dictatorship we had was, it's a kind of Islamist military dictatorship. So the way that she is also privileged in some regards, in other regards she is also vulnerable, right, because of questions around gender and so on. So yeah, so absolutely, I think it for me it's a very fascinating question, this question of the
Mhm.
diaspora, because I think diaspora diasporas are so big now. Like there's so, any place you go in the West, there's just diasporas from all over the world, and the
Yeah.
numbers are increasing, and global movement is happening for all kinds of reasons. And so then to think about what that really means, especially when it comes to relating again to places of origin, having this relationship to multiple homes, is really fascinating to me, because yeah, it's a question I deal with all the time, in
Yeah.
my own life.
Absolutely. And also, like with the filmmaking, one of the things that came to mind, because she was so adamant that she wanted it to be this like observation film, she wanted it to be, she was just trying to show something. It made me think a lot about how at the moment, so much of what we're only able to do with regards to what's happening in Sudan, but also like in Gaza and in the Congo and in many places around the world at the moment. It feels like the world is just
Mm-hmm.
collapsing around us, is to observe, is to
Mm-hmm.
bear witness. And also there are other things that we can be doing and we should be doing, but a large proportion of our time, I would say, on a daily basis at the moment is
Mm.
observing. It's on our
Mhm.
phones where we're looking at news coming in from journalists and activists around the world telling us what's happening. We might be sharing it, we might be then leading it into action, but so much of it is based on this act of observance or bearing witness.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
obviously, I hope that it's setting the foundation for something bigger and it's setting the foundation for us to be able to do something. But
Mhm.
it's a really difficult position to be in anyway. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on this act of being
Mhm.
right now just as observers in many ways.
Absolutely. It's interesting because I think Ghost Season begins with this image of this burnt corpse. And I've been thinking a lot about just these images of corpses that we've been seeing in the news of unburied bodies, unclaimed bodies in Sudan, in Gaza, in all of these places. And so for me, yeah, I feel like there is something witnessing is extremely important. And I think it's not the only thing, it's the first step perhaps, but it's
Mhm.
necessary. And I also think that I've been thinking a lot in the context of just the emergencies that we are finding ourselves in right now globally. I've really been thinking a lot about, okay, literature, what does it do? And sometimes I think, what am I doing? Sitting, writing books, spending years writing a book. It's useless. And what is necessary is activism. And of course, activism is absolutely necessary. But then sometimes you also read a novel that really reminds you of the importance and the power of literature. For me, most recently, I had that experience, for instance, with Denis Shibli's Minor Detail, right? The novel, amazing novel. And I think that book is so necessary in terms of bearing witness and being a kind of memory, right? Like containing, I think literature is the memory of the violence. It's also somehow provides the kind of the images and the symbolism that make sense of things, even when it is this kind of unimaginable violence. And so I do feel that it is really, bearing witness is really important on the daily level, what we're doing in terms of just somehow not blocking it out and really paying attention, and somehow paying attention to all of these unburied, unclaimed bodies that we're seeing, right? But also that it is really necessary to, I think it's a balancing act, right? That the literature is necessary, the kind of engagement and the activism is necessary. And I think different people have different strengths and different kind of abilities. But yeah, but it's a question, I think it's a hard question we're all dealing with, in terms of this also sense of helplessness that one has of, okay, I'm going to the protests, I'm writing the letters, I'm doing this and that, but it's some things are still not shifting. But I also believe that, I also somehow believe in the change is happening in an invisible way, right? So for me, I have to think, for in Sudan, our moment of great hope was the 2019 revolution, right? Which ended the Bashir dictatorship, and there was this really amazing moment of hope, almost a happy ending, when things were really looking up. And then unfortunately, these two generals, Burhan and Dagalo, came and destroyed everything, and we're now in this terrible war. But I still believe that what was somehow sown in that revolution is still there. And that you see it even in this war, that these networks of solidarity and community and mutual aid, that people, the way that people came to each other's aid and supported each other through this insane violence, apocalyptic violence, that was also somehow, the revolution is there. It's not forgotten, and it will somehow one day come back and bear more fruit, but that it already is. And I think the same thing thinking about Gaza and Palestine, and the fact that I'm old enough to remember that you couldn't there's definitely been a change in the discourse around Gaza, right? So there is a shift that has happened in the consciousness of people, as there's no silver lining to a genocide, there can never be, but this idea that people, because of what's happening, there's a new awareness of the history of Israel Palestine, a new understanding, and that things are shifting, they're moving, and it will again at some point bear fruition. And yeah, and you take hope again, and thinking back to all of these struggles that preceded, and the fact that slavery ended, it's a miracle, given that slavery, people were not even considered people, they were property. So the fact that institution came to an end is a miracle, and yet it happened, and it happened through people bearing witness and organizing and resisting and rebelling and so on. So I take hope from all of that. And yeah, but I think it does feel like we are living in very extreme times right now. So for me, switching between news of Palestine and Sudan, it's nonstop to see this kind of unceasing violence. And I would say, in terms of the book itself, part of the reason also why am I writing a novel and not like journalism about the North South Civil War, because I also think it's a way of bearing witness that literature also gives you this ability to empathize. For me, the power of literature is the way that it allows you to enter into the experience of another person on a very visceral, emotional level. And I do believe in this, that it's not only important to understand things analytically, or that, okay, X number of people died in this war, X number of people are starving, but that you have to understand that on a visceral, emotional, physical level. And I think literature is perhaps the thing that allows for that kind of the closest kind of art that allows for that sort of experience. So for me, reading, when I was researching again the North South Civil War, I remember the accounts that were really, really affected me were not like the UN reports that summarized everything. It was the sort of first person testimonies that people were of what they went through. And for me, it was partly about translating that in the novel through these stories. And there's some heavy depictions of this violence that happens during the Civil War, but trying to somehow translate that in the daily experience of people who are living their lives, and then suddenly this war enters and ends everything. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just as you were talking, the 2019 revolution in Sudan, in my mind, the imagery from that revolution just has stayed with me as being bold and so strong, because it was a revolution that was predominantly students, young people, and women. And we
Mhm.
had women in, Sudanese clothing, making speeches, addressing crowds, and leading chants. And it was, I just remember, even talking right now, and I can feel like goosebumps. I just remember feeling so empowered and emboldened by it. And in Bangladesh recently, we had the ousting of the Bangladeshi Bengali prime minister, and again that was very much youth led, and we had the voices of women. And I don't think the two are not disconnected, right? Like, things inspire other places and other people over time, and I know just from talking to people how many people were then inspired by what happened there, and just
Mhm.
feeling so renewed by it. And obviously, like, when you're living through a genocide, or whatever the situation, it can, I can't even imagine, but I can't imagine that the spirit of the revolution mustn't always be alive because you're struggling to survive. But I guess on some level it is, and I hope that it stays alive, because I just remember that the images from 2019, and I was like, this is amazing.
Yeah.
This is amazing. Like, I think there is a lot of courage to be taken from that, a lot of hope for the future as well. And for anybody that doesn't know what happened, I really hope people look back and learn from it, because we have so much to learn from it. I think if something like that happened in Sudan in 2019, what could we actually achieve now at the
Mhm.
end of 2024, 2025, with everything happening around the world? Honestly, it feels like the possibilities are endless, right? If we are seeing entire revolutions taking place and leaders being ousted. And I think you're right, especially like with Gaza, there has definitely been a shift
Mhm.
in understanding. I think not only, as you said, like, not only narrative, but I think there is a real interest in
Mhm.
people to understand exactly what's gone on.
Mhm.
I think people are no longer just accepting a
Mhm.
story that they're being fed.
Mhm.
And I really, yeah, I think that's something to hold on to. And I'm also, one of the things I'm so impressed with generally is that I feel like activism has not slowed down, it has not stopped or dried up,
Mhm.
which is normally, I feel like people tire after a few weeks or a few months. But the sustained pressure, I think, is also really inspiring and really hopeful.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, but yeah, that's really
Yeah.
great. One of the other elements of your story is very sweet and wholesome, a love story. So we have William, who has fallen head over heels in love with Layla, who is this very sweet, slightly cheeky cook who's working in the compound, who has dealt with a really difficult family situation and background. But William and Layla are also, I guess, like an unlikely couple.
Mhm.
They are from completely different backgrounds. Why did you decide to have that in the mix of the story that you were telling?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about, again, in some sense, certain taboos within Sudanese society about, for instance, marriage across ethnic lines, religious lines. And in the relationship of William and Layla, I wanted to explore what, in some sense, what does it mean for two people who are not meant to be together, not really allowed to be together, to fall in love. And in some sense, as the North and the South are falling apart in this civil war and splitting, William, who is from South Sudan, Christian, and Layla, who is Northern Sudan, nomad, different ethnic groups, Muslim, they fall in love, right? And so I was again thinking of this, the way that for me the possibility, the hope of connections across these very rigid political or ethnic or religious boundaries often happen on this, in on the intimate level, on the level of friendship, on the level of love. And so I wanted to explore that. And also, William himself is an interesting character because he's South Sudanese. He, because of the war, he was displaced to the north, and he speaks Arabic. He is culturally fluid. And so also to think that, again, identity is not so simple. It's not, oh, you're just like South Sudanese Christian and you're in this box, and you're North Sudanese Muslim and you're in this box, right? That the relationships actually are much more complicated than that. So I wanted to, yeah, so that was the thought with Layla and William. And again, thinking, going back to this idea of a non-biological family that is somehow crossing all of these different boundaries of ethnicity and religion and language and so on. And that begins with Layla and William and Mustafa, who's their surrogate son, becomes, in a way, who's also not related to them, but is somehow adopted by William, or is William is a sort of father figure to him, even though, again, William is a different ethnicity, different background, etc. Yeah.
I thought it was obviously like very fascinating and interesting to be thinking about these two people that come from such different backgrounds and whether or not they're going to make it. Are they going to be able to get married? Um,
Mhm.
but it was also, I think, a reminder as well that, like, even though when there's so much other things going on, people are still also falling in love and making friends and doing all of these things, which is always really lovely. But it was really interesting to understand a little bit as to like how difficult that relationship between North and South Sudan is. And we see it really early on in the novel as well, when this corpse turns up and they don't
Mhm.
know this is an unidentified body. And there's all this conversation about where do we bury the body because they don't know who it is. And that, I think, brought out some real tensions. And there was, I think it was Alex at one point, who was like, why can't we just bury it here in the middle? Which I found really, again, just like, oh, you can't just bury it in the middle. Obviously not, silly Alex. But I guess if you're trying to understand the complexities and trying to understand the situation, the reality is that in a situation like that, there is no man's land, right? There is no middle ground when the situation is so fraught.
Mhm.
And I also liked that, as you said, Layla and William, they have Mustafa, who ends up almost like a surrogate son. And he's really young, he's 12 or something, and he's just trying to hustle and trying to build a life for himself, but he doesn't have an education, he's never been to school. He's got like a very strange relationship with his family as well, and lots of money pressures. But he is a child.
Mhm.
And I wondered what you were also trying to show us in some ways about the life of children um,
Mhm.
in places like Sudan, where they are denied the childhood of happiness and opportunity, and the fact that he started working for an NGO, which again, you would never have an NGO here employ a child, but
Mhm.
in Sudan, they seem to be okay with it.
Mhm. Yeah, Mustafa, for me, I was really interested in thinking about children who have to be adults, which are children you often encounter in places like Sudan because of circumstances of poverty or war or so on. Also, something that we're seeing now, again, watching the news and all these wars, where you see, for instance, an 8-year-old child taking care at like a parent of their 2-year
Mm.
old child, right? A 2-year old sibling. And so with Mustafa, I was really interested in that he's a child who has to take care of himself and who has to make the decisions of an adult, even though he doesn't have the experience of an adult. And this is what gets him into trouble. But this is something I'm always fascinated by when I go to Sudan, is like for instance, in Khartoum, when you encounter these young children working, supporting families, taking care of siblings, and
Mhm.
think of childhood in a place like Sudan under circumstances of poverty, displacement, etc., versus the way that in New York, sort of middle class children are pampered, extremely pampered. So I was really, yeah. So with him, I was thinking about that and what, how does a child think in these circumstances? What do they have to deal with, and what are the consequences of that for him? At the same time, of course, he looks up to William, looks after him. He feels very connected to William. And so there is something in that he also has a guardian in the form of William in a way, but he's still an independent little person who's making these very big decisions that get him into trouble. Yeah.
Yeah. I really loved the book. And as you said at the beginning of the book, the Civil War is in the background and it's like this looming presence. And as the story develops, it becomes more and more real and it
Mhm.
edges closer. And we see all of our characters in one way or another impacted by it. And I just think it was such a wonderful and beautiful execution of a really important story. What do you hope for anyone that picks up your novel?
Oof, yeah, that's a hard question. I hope that the book gives them some sense of Sudan and a kind of a deeper understanding of Sudan than maybe what they encounter normally in the news, the limited, let's say, depictions there are in the news. And I really, yeah, I hope again that the book, even though it's not sad, that it also gives or contains a sense of hope, that it's not just it's a sad story, but that there's also this feeling of hope that one kind of leaves the book with, which is also again something I'm thinking about a lot in the context of the war now in Sudan, in terms of trying to hold on to the possibilities, the relationships, the glimmers of hope that are somehow still there.
Yeah, absolutely. And with relation to everything going on in Sudan at the moment, if there's anything that you could say to our listeners right now
Mhm.
about what's happening or about what you think that we should be doing or how we should be feeling, what would you say?
I think I would say please keep Sudan in your minds and hearts. Please pay attention to what's happening there. Please share, because it is really invisible. It's a very invisible conflict, as conflicts in Africa tend to be. So please just try to, even though there is so much going on in the world right now, I think it's important for listeners, for people to also try to connect the dots between all of this violence that's happening in different parts of the global south. So whether it's Gaza, whether it is Sudan, and to support in whatever way you can, whether that's by sharing news, whether that's by donating. I can also give you some links, maybe if people want to later donate to these community kitchens that are keeping a lot of people alive, for instance, on the ground in Sudan. But just to really try and not to forget about Sudan, and to try and support in whatever way you can, whether it's like financially, by giving attention, by sharing news. That would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. Fatin, thank you so much for your time today. It's been so wonderful speaking to you, and I hope that more people do pick up Ghost Season because honestly, it's absolutely brilliant.
Thank you so much, Samia. It was a real pleasure to visit you today.
I hope you loved listening to this episode and found things that will stay with you. I'd love to hear from you, so please do reach out on social media and don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a review as it can really help.